I'm Kate.
I'm Callie.
We're two friends who met in an early modern history MA,
Welcome to the first series of our new podcast, Six Queens.
where queenship reigns supreme.
So, this episode, we are going to be letting our queens introduce themselves in a little bit more detail and really getting them to showcase a little bit about them and about their relationship with Henry and what we can learn from that. So, what we're ultimately going to be discussing is their symbols that surrounded them and their badges and the mottos.
For those who don't know, when one of our queens married Henry and became queen, they chose, or something was chosen for them, a badge, which is like a symbol that represents them, but also a motto that stays with them throughout their queenship and is the ideal that they aspire to. And what's really interesting is that some of these are really indicative of personality, and some of them are a little hard to make out. So we're going to be going through and looking at how all of these things introduce the queens to us.
So I think in that case, a good place to start would be, as Julie Andrews says, at the beginning, because it's a very good place to start. So Catherine's motto that she chose was humble and loyal, and the badge that she chose was the pomegranate. What's interesting about Catherine's pomegranate, and I think with her, we could just have a whole episode on just talking about the pomegranate and the significance. For your sake as listeners, we're not going to do that. So we'll try and keep it as short and sweet as we can. The pomegranate itself for Catherine held a lot of significance, especially as a foreign princess and then later queen of Henry VIII. Coming from Spain to England, she, for that physical separation from home, I think must have been incredibly daunting for her. So she always had this sort of reminder of home with her pomegranate, which was incorporated into the Spanish royal coat of arms. But what I think is also really important is with the pomegranate is understanding its significance. And I think this is what makes Catherine's symbol, or badge rather, what probably one of the saddest, I don't know if you would agree, Kate, but it being that symbol for fertility, and then ultimately her only being able to give Henry one daughter, and that being the source of her downfall, I think it's really sad.
Yeah, a pomegranate, for those of you who have ever cut into one, the biggest thing that I think sticks in the mind about a pomegranate is how many seeds are in it. And it's this idea of Catherine herself, I guess, being a pomegranate and literally having all of these seeds and the fertility. And yet, I mean, she was able to conceive a lot, but she ultimately sort of failed in that duty. She was not able to produce many living children. So yeah, there's a tragic irony to her picking that symbol because of her purpose as a queen consort, giving Henry children, and yet not being able to do that. And yes, that being her downfall.
And I think the other side of the pomegranate, again, probably for someone like Catherine, where it has significance, is within that Christian iconography and that ideals about resurrection. And I think, again, going back to that idea of fertility and kind of being full of seed, that, her being able to resurrect that Tudors dynasty and kind of create it and keep it going. I don't think it would have been an irony that would have been lost on her or those around her, which I think for me is quite possibly one of the saddest things.
Another thing that really strikes me about the pomegranate, Catherine's pomegranate in particular, is how often you see it. So one of the reasons why we talk about these badges is because they are physically a part of a lot of the spaces that these queens inhabit. It really is the branding. It's, as much as Tudor roses are included in places, the pomegranate, for example, would be included next to it. The example that springs to mind is at Hampton Court. For anyone who's had the chance to go to Hampton Court, right outside the Great Hall, there's a doorway that has a carving of a Tudor rose entwined with a pomegranate, which is a symbol of Henry and Catherine's marriage. So it's not necessarily just something that, Catherine has privately, these images of a pomegranate like embroidered onto stuff. It's very public. So it makes it even more tragic, really, that all of these people are associating her with the symbol of fertility, and yet it's not happening.
I just kind of want to go back to that point that you picked up on about it being very visible at Hampton Court and being seen alongside that Tudor rose. because I think there's something enduring about Catherine's symbol with the pomegranate as well. Even after, Henry divorced her, it's still being used, it's still being seen. And while there are some attempts to kind of cover it up, there's not that immediate detachment that Henry had with Catherine as he did with Anne, with that, that destruction of her falcon and any kind of imagery associated with her. Personally, I think is quite telling of maybe his feelings of Anne as opposed to Catherine, and also that kind of public consciousness of Catherine.
That's a fantastic segue for me talking about Anne Boleyn, because one of the things I find so striking about Anne Boleyn's personal badge, which was a falcon, is how much she used it in everything. And I think that speaks to how prevalent Catherine's pomegranate was, because suddenly the pomegranate's gone, Catherine's gone, Anne has to put her falcon everywhere to assert that she is now the queen. So you see Anne Boleyn's falcon on everything, like art that's associated with Anne, manuscripts associated with Anne. Hans Holbein creates silver plate and goblets with falcons all over them. It's Anne's PR move to replace the pomegranate. So yes, Anne's symbol was a falcon, specifically a white or silver peregrine falcon. This was for two reasons, sort of like Catherine's. It had a family connection. Anne's father had just been declared the heir of the house of the Earls of Ormond, which is a earldom in Ireland, and their symbol is a falcon. So it was showing that she does come from nobility, even if that claim is sort of tenuous. But it also, a falcon is a bird of prey. It's a bird that hunts to achieve an object. It flies for an object. So that's a very blatant connection to Anne's pursuit of Henry, or Henry's pursuit of Anne, whichever you think. What's interesting about her falcon is that it's actually sitting on top of a tree stump or a woodstock. And from that woodstock, there are roses sprouting. The tree stump is a symbol of an interrupted life, something that is lifeless that was once alive. And the idea of the roses growing out of it is that she's bringing new life to this thing thought dead. So the idea being, very blatantly, that Anne's going to bring new life to the Tudor dynasty, where Catherine wasn't able to. What I like about Anne's is, as we said in the beginning, it's one of those that actually shows her personality and her motives very clearly. We know that she most likely designed it herself because the elements of it are so deeply symbolic, and they are so representative of her and her cause and her perceived position coming into Catherine's throne. The falcon is seen as a very aggressive bird. It's a bird of prey. It's graceful and it's beautiful, but ultimately it is a very strong bird. And you see there is an example on a sheet of music written for Anne Boleyn of a falcon pecking out a pomegranate. So it's sort of the symbolic representation of Anne's bird being dominant over the Catherine's pomegranate, which is sort of a sentient object in this case.
It's brilliant. I just think it's so deliciously petty, and also it just does really well to serve a point that, if you're paying attention, there is just every opportunity to, play the game of court and just to play that game of politics and just take a swipe at anybody where possible. I just think it's very Anne.
It is very Anne.
I love it.
Yeah, that's why I really like all of her symbology. And her motto is kind of the same way. It's not this sort of generic, like, I'm going to be humble and loyal because I'm a woman. Her chosen motto as queen was "the most happy," which is the one that appears on a commemorative coin, which is believed to commemorate her becoming pregnant after Elizabeth. So with, this time it'll be a boy. It says Anne Boleyn, the most happy, so we think that was her motto. And it's so unlike all the other ones. I mean, as you'll hear when we go into the other ones, and because it just shows all of this personality. It's a very assertive political motto of like, I'm here, I don't care what you think.
I love that idea of the most happy sitting either side of Catherine of Aragon, again, that humble and loyal. And then also segueing onto Jane Seymour, whose motto was bound to obey and serve. Again, it's that dichotomy of personality and that idea of who we can see having influence and autonomy over themselves, I think is quite fun. So just maybe sliding on over then to have a chat about Jane Seymour, and with her, a bit like Anne, I think in a sense there's a lot to unpack with her symbol, because what she had was a crowned phoenix rising out of a castle with red and white roses. So again, a lot like Anne in that sense, it does a lot going on. And again, I think you talk for forever really about the idea of the phoenix and what it represented. But traditionally, the idea of the phoenix was to do with rebirth and kind of renewal, which again, I think if we take that as a direct contrast of the immediate events of, her becoming queen after Anne's downfall, it's quite a powerful image in and of itself. For me, at least, there does tend to be that idea of Jane Seymour, being that that loyal wife and, serving and doing the right thing. But I don't know, what do you think? Do you think there's an air of pettiness about it, or an air of I'm here to stay?
I don't think it's petty, or at least I don't think that's the right word to describe it. I mean, there is some element of I win, you lose, but I do think it's a lot more powerful than that, because it's also worth mentioning that the phoenix not only became Jane's symbol, but it became the symbol of her family as well, of her brothers who were promoted by Henry VIII and are suddenly these high-ranking nobles in court. So it's this idea of, like you said, the Seymours are here to stay. The Seymours are powerful again.
No, and I think that's a really good point that you pick up on, especially about her brothers, because like you said, they do become formidable, political players in their own right. And I think that also really feeds into that motto that Jane picked as well. I think it's kind of like a family rallying point. It almost comes out as, toe the line, you've got to do what you've got to do, but, better things are going to come if you obey and do as you're told. I think that's quite interesting.
And Jane is often, I think rightly so, depicted as the antithesis of Anne Boleyn. Whether or not that was true or that was a political move by her own design, Jane is seen as the one who is not as willful as Anne, who is more submissive than Anne, who is more of an ideal wife than Anne. So the motto bound to obey and serve really drives that point home. Jane's not the most happy. She's not reveling in anything. She's there for Henry. She is there to obey his whim.
For sure. And I don't think we can ignore that either. I can see you shaking your head. So I think it's important that we talk about that, because, Jane was there. She saw what happened to Anne. And I think there has to be an element of, oh, no, that's not going to be me. That can't be me. I think in that case, and that idea of fashioning herself as as almost, like you said, the anti-Anne is really important. What I also find really lovely with, especially when we are thinking about Jane Seymour's motto and her badge, is her epitaph. So thinking about that epitaph for her, and that idea, I suppose, of her really breathing new life into the Tudor dynasty, when it reads, "Here a phoenix lieth, whose death to another phoenix gave breath. It is lamented much. The world once never knew two such." I don't know. I think there's something really beautiful and really quite touching about that idea being used in regards to such a powerful image.
In this case, Jane herself is the phoenix, giving new life to Henry after the drama with the Boleyns. It's Jane and the Seymours rising from the Boleyn ashes. But in this case, it's also, she's giving new life to the Tudor dynasty in the form of her son, who she died giving birth to. That is very powerful imagery. And it makes sense why then the Seymours would keep the phoenix as their badge for many years, because this is their legacy.
100%.
Once Jane died, of course, the next queen to come in was Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves doesn't have a lot of information surrounding her queenly symbology, simply because she was not queen for very long. We do have a motto for Anne of Cleves, which is "God send me well to keep." This idea that she is being sent to fulfill a duty as the new wife of the King of England. As far as a badge, it gets a little complicated. Anne doesn't have a badge of her own. The one that's most associated with her is part of the ducal crest of Cleves, which is a carbuncle, a shield, and in this case it is a gold carbuncle. And this is interesting because unlike the other queens, this is a very blatant display of her own heritage. This is Anne coming in and saying that she's a princess, basically, in her own right. It's showing her heritage. The symbol that she did use when she was a princess, so not when she was a queen, but I think this shows a little bit more of her personality, is 2 white swans, which together represents innocence and sincerity. So this idea that she is this ideal maiden waiting to have a husband.
I think it's interesting that, you pick up on that idea of her emulating her family duty and kind of responsibility and that familial connection when she came to England as a queen, because I think it's almost in direct contrast to Catherine of Aragon, who, yes, picked the pomegranate, yes, it's reminiscent of her home, but that took on a life of its own and became shorthand for Queen Catherine of Aragon, where for Anna Cleves, it never really did that. I suppose, to your point, she didn't really have the chance, unlike Catherine, who had about 20 odd years to do it. So I do wonder if, she had the chance, it would have done the same thing, but I don't see it doing that, because I think there was something so powerful with Catherine of Aragon's pomegranate and her as a queen that the others maybe lacked.
Yes, this is certainly one that doesn't necessarily show Anne's personality, and that could just be because she didn't have time to decide on a badge of her own, or else it wasn't circulated because there was no time. Or it could be that in making this alliance, her brother in Cleves wanted to make clear that his sister, somebody from his house, was now the Queen of England, which is an incredibly high status role. So, it's hard to say. And I think it's not any reflection on Anne, like, oh, this doesn't show her personality. She had none. It's just the amount of time, the lack of time.
Which I think for her is a bit of a shame. But, I think with her, we often know that she was never very happy as queen. So the fact that she got out of it quite quickly, and, her and Henry enjoyed that kind of very close bond, is maybe more telling about any iconography that we have.
Yeah, it's why I brought in the swans, just to give something of hers that was a little bit along the lines of the others. But again, 2 white swans, which is a very often used symbol of maidenhood, doesn't say much about her either, really. It's fairly commonly used, and it's an ideal that Anne certainly would have wanted to promote if she's being put on the marriage market, as it were.
I definitely think you're right there. But what is strange is that wife number 4 and 5, so Anna Cleves and Catherine Howard, both of their symbols and both of their mottos, are don't really say too much about them. So with Catherine Howard, we've got a motto of no other will than his. Now, the his, very obvious, we're talking about Henry here. And her symbol and her badge that she had was a crowned Tudor rose, but it was thornless. So I think that's quite an important point to stress. So it was a crowned red and white thornless Tudor rose. Now, because we know so very, very little about Catherine Howard, there's a lot of speculation about her early life and what really happened to her. I think it's quite hard to try and pull any discernible identity out of that. But what I do think is interesting is the idea of the medal that was commissioned to celebrate their marriage. So on the medal itself, it was what it effectively said, a rose without a thorn. So, you got that ideal that, she's going to be the, quiet, ideal wife. She wasn't going to cause any waves. She wasn't going to cause him any issues. And I'm laughing because I just think it's fantastic. Again, the irony that's kind of caught up in that. So I think my question with that, and maybe surrounding the mottos and the badges more generally, is who really picked them, and how much personal identity is there as opposed to how much familial identity is in there. But I think with Catherine Howard especially, I think there's definitely a driving force of that Howard family trying to distance themselves from the Boleyn downfall.
For me, I would interpret it as a mixture of two things. The first being, like you said, the Howards, who were also the people who were related to Anne Boleyn and sort of put her in the path of Henry, and ultimately had to step away once that fell out spectacularly. It was them trying to reassert themselves as servants of the crown. This idea that they are presenting Henry with the ideal rose without a thorn. So I do think that they definitely that was a big driving factor in selecting this iconography. But I also think that Catherine, being so young, I mean, she was 16, 17. We don't quite know when she was born, but her being so young, I don't know about you, but when I was 16 and 17, I didn't really have a clear idea of who I was and what my motives were as a politician. So it could just be that she went with the thing that was the most stereotypical, the Tudors' roses, and it worked. I mean, she did choose a good badge, and she had a good image for herself as the rose without a thorn. It appealed to her new husband because it was not individualistic. It was very much a reflection of him. I think that I think her age had a lot to do with it. This idea that she was tragically so young that she didn't really have time to develop any of this culture around herself.
I definitely think there is something to be said for what you've just said about her age. She, like you said, she was 16, 17 years old. I think, she lacked that sort of worldly presence that, other people like Catherine and Anne definitely have. We're expecting her to compete on that same sort of level and have that same strong sense of self. I don't necessarily think her symbol was a bad one. I think it was very fitting for her, and I think we definitely need to remember that.
And stop having this idea of it being almost hilariously ironic. We discussed Catherine's pomegranate as being tragically ironic because she was ultimately unable to be the fertile pomegranate. The way I've always seen Catherine thornless rose perceived is that how ironic that this is the one that cheated on Henry, is, his rose without a thorn, when ultimately it should be seen as tragically as Catherine's pomegranate. You're setting up a 17-year-old to fail. You're basically saying that she has no faults at all. So then when she does ultimately fail, it's that much more poignant, I think.
For sure. And like you said, I think we're all in danger of doing that. And I think, again, putting her within the context of where she was, this wasn't someone, again, like we said, who was adept to the world of court and politics. She didn't have that traditional noble upbringing. And we know very little about her, and we know even less about her education. So yeah, there is definitely a point for pause here when we do talk about her.
Lastly, we have Catherine Parr, who is the sixth and final of our queens. And I think personally her badges and her motto says a lot about her, but it's maybe not quite as complex as, say, Anne Boleyn's or Jane Seymour's. Catherine's badge is a maiden rising from a Tudor rose. Specifically, the maiden is St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was Catherine's patron saint. St. Catherine is known for piety and loyalty, and this is something that the Parr family used in their iconography quite a bit. So it does have that connection to Catherine's family, but it also is very personal because a patron saint who is often the saint with the same name as you, or maybe you were born on a saint's day, somebody who is with you your whole life. So Catherine, even before she was married to Henry, would use wheels, Catherine wheels, which is a symbol of St. Catherine of Alexandria. So it only makes sense for her, I think, to continue using this as a symbol of herself as a person. So it shows great individuality, in my opinion.
It's interesting that hers is the most overtly religious, and kind of that expression of kind of saints and things like that. Especially when we're talking about people like Catherine of Aragon, whose faith was, the be all and end all for them. And I think that's quite an interesting point that you picked up on. We tend to think of her more as like, an education reform and a religious reformer. So I think it's quite interesting that a saint, which is, traditionally that kind of associated with Catholicism, is one that she uses.
I do think, though, that however maybe odd it is that somebody with such Lutheran tendencies would use a saint, I do think that if you grew up with something and if you identified so strongly with a guardian, really, that's what these saints were to a lot of people. If you grew up sort of viewing Saint Catherine as somebody who was there for you and who you could identify with in any of her traits, it would stick with you, even if you're not necessarily, say, praying to her because of your reformed religious beliefs.
It's lovely and personal, and it gives you a very intimate reflection about her way of thinking about herself.
Where she doesn't show individuality, in my opinion, is through her motto, which almost feeds more into the stereotype we have of her as the nurse and the companion for Henry in his final days. Her motto is to be useful in all that I do. And to me, that stereotypical image of Catherine as a nurse tending Henry's wounds comes to the forefront of my mind, even though I know that it's not true.
And I think that's a really hard thing to kind of escape from. So, like you said, with that motto, and I think it very much instills that idea of what it means to be a 16th century wife or a queen. And I think in a sense, it's almost very reminiscent of Jane Seymour's, that honor and obey, but, talking about utility instead.
I will say, I do think it's not as extreme as, say, humble and loyal or bound to obey and serve, or even no other will than his. She's going to be useful, which I think is a very clever way to say it. She wants to be useful. She wants to help, but she doesn't necessarily want to be ruled, maybe like the other one. So I'll take it back. I will say that there is a hint of her personality in there. This idea that she, in her own right, is a very well-educated woman who is capable of doing things for herself. But to me, it is interesting looking at it, knowing the stereotype that grew up around her, this idea of her as the nurse and the companion and the person who takes care of Henry while he's, ailing and he's about to die. It's almost, I'm thinking, Catherine, you should have known that this was coming. You should have picked better. But it is useful is a very interesting word, I will say.
I always think the word useful is interesting, but I don't know. Worth pondering over.
For sure. And we do have to keep in mind that with all of them, not just Catherine's, they are very particularly chosen. It's not like they just came to Catherine one day after she had accepted the king's marriage proposal and said, hey, what do you think you want your motto to be? This is something that Catherine thought over. This was something that her family and other advisors thought over. This is something that the king and his advisors had to approve. So we should make clear how just political these are. It's not just the queens wanting to tell us about themselves as people. This is them telling us about them as queens and what their political use is going to be. There are some exceptions. I think Anne flirts with this whole individualistic thing a lot more than the others, but it's all very curated. It's chosen all for a reason, and the wording has to be perfect.
And I think it's interesting that you pick up on that point, because even for someone like Catherine of Aragon, who, as we know, was married to Henry VIII's brother previously, before he died quite suddenly, her pomegranate wasn't actually signed off until she married Henry in 1509. And that's a long time coming. She'd been in England a while, just over 10 years at this point. It'd been a long time coming for her. Like you said, that they're not just chosen on a whim. They are specific. And again, I think there is that idea then of a public personality and a private personality, and where do you draw the line between the two? How much of these women are reflected in that, how much is their family or something like that?
My concluding question for you, but for both of us, is, having gone through all of the badges and the symbols, when we go through them, let's go one by one again. What do you think it says about them going forward? Because we're using this episode to introduce our main characters, as it were, going forward. So what do you think, if you had to summarize, what do you think each thing says about them? And we'll start with Catherine of Aragon.
Oh, I think for her, it's sort of that idea of wanting to show the richness of her heritage, but also that need of looking to the future. Go back to that idea in that discussion that we had earlier about, being full of seeds and kind of rebirth and kind of regeneration. I think for her, definitely that dichotomy of looking to the past, looking where I've come from, that strong idea of familial self and the future. How about you? What do you think about Anne? I think
And I mean, I've said it probably 100 times by now in the recording of this episode. I think Anne's is the most fun of all of them, just because it shows her personality so well, not just herself, but her political personality, in that, you know, she's chosen a bird of prey, that it does have connections to her family legacy, but it also is her as an animal. You know, if I had to associate Anne Boleyn with an animal, I probably would pick a bird of prey because of, you know, the beauty, and it's enigmatic, and but it also, it knows what it wants and it goes after what it wants. In terms of the motto, I think what the motto says about her is that she's reveling in her role, and she, until the end, that's what she did. She really liked having the role of queen, even if she ultimately didn't enjoy it at the end.
I definitely think you're right with Anne. I think, you know, she's one of those people that, had she been a theatrical kid at school, you know, give her a stage and she would have thrived and would have been like, you know, president of that drama club or something. But yeah, I definitely think you're right. And I like the idea that she ultimately said, you know, I am happy, I am having fun, like, you know, I'm living my best life, for want of a better phrase. I think it's very reassuring in a sense, and very comforting that she could just be outwardly herself while being politically engaged.
And I like how the connection between the falcon and then later the phoenix very well illustrates the transition from Anne Boleyn to Jane Seymour.
Oh yeah, definitely. Again, I think what's different with these two, it is that motto that sets them apart. Again, that idea of being necessarily that anti-Anne and kind of fitting the mold that Henry wants. Again, whether or not that's who she really was, I think that, again, that's a question for a different day, and something that, you know, I'm sure people could argue over for the longest time. But yes, I like the idea that she's reflecting Anne with choosing a bird, but saying something very different.
And I think it's hard to draw many conclusions from the next two, from Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, just because, well, their tenure wasn't very long, first of all, but also it doesn't show a lot of individuality and political strategy like these, Anne and Jane's, these last two. So what we can say about them is, for Anne of Cleves, that she wasn't queen for very long, so she chose to display her heritage and her status as a princess, which, very smart. I mean, you're coming over to become the Queen of England, you might as well show off your pedigree.
And I think something very similar could be said for Catherine Howard, in the sense that for both of them, simplicity is key. You know, what do? You effectively got two blank canvases. You know, they're not established court players, or, you know, haven't stolen the king's heart very publicly, you know, especially for Anne Cleves. What do we do? And I think that's true of both of them. They don't understand the world they've just entered. So why not stick with something safe?
And two, the lack of personality in their badges sort of aligns with how little we know about them. I mean, we know a little bit more about Anne of Cleves because she sticks around in England. She becomes a member of the court. We can kind of make inferences as to her personality based on reactions to her. But we really don't know her that well as a person. And these symbols reflect that. And that's certainly true of Catherine Howard, just because there are no sources about her early life. And she died so young that we really never got the chance to see her as, you know, as an adult in her final form.
Yeah, and I think that is really the saddest thing for them. And I think, you know, there is an air of, you call it irony, call it sadness, running through each of them, really. You know, even if you look at Jane Seymour's, yes, you know, we've got that phoenix, you rising from the ashes, and it's, again, like you said earlier, it was picked up by the rest of the Seymour family, and, you know, they ran with it, and, you know, you had Edward, but at what cost? You know, was that kind of emblematic of her being that phoenix, burning as bright as it possibly could before it burnt out? I don't know. At that point, I am just talking out loud. But
it
again,
was very poetic.
Oh, thank you, dear. But yeah, I definitely think there is, you know, running through all it, like I said, that call it irony, call it sadness, but there's something there in each of them that we need to take the time to see. But I don't know, bring us home. Tell me your thoughts on Catherine Parr. What do you think that says about her?
Catherine Parr, I'm half and half, because, as I said, the motto is a bit jarring for me. This idea of her being useful is not something that I associate with her, knowing her as as an individual. But I do admire her badge because she uses her patron saint, something that is extremely indicative of her as a person. This is somebody who she probably grew up identifying herself with. So whereas other queens are putting out their heraldry, they're putting out symbols of their parents' conquests of another country, Catherine is putting out her patron saint. And I really like that. I think it just shows that she is very, very strong and she knows herself very well. She's very mature.
And I think that's a really nice place to end, with someone that is sure of themselves and they know themselves. She had time to grow up. She had time to develop that idea of self. And I think there's something really lovely about that, about the fact that they were never equals in that sense, but, they were well matched in that intellectual capacity.
It was fun doing research for this episode and figuring out that this was the way that we wanted the queens to introduce themselves. I think simply because of how well most of the symbols fit the story. I mean, a lot of the queens chose these before they ultimately, certainly, but they didn't know what was going to happen to them. So I think certain things, like you were saying about the phoenix, burning bright before it too goes out, and the irony of Catherine Howard being the thornless rose. How well, for better or worse, it ends up fitting these women and their stories. I think it's a really great way to consider them and consider their stories before we go forward and we talk about things a little bit more broadly and thematically.
Yeah, and what I hopefully, my hope from this one is that we've introduced people are listening, so you guys, to them well enough that you whether you come spend time with us, go do your own reading, whatever it is you want to do, but spark that intellectual curiosity to find out more about them. I think that's always my biggest hope.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of our new podcast. In the next episode, Kate and I will continue your introduction by discussing queenship and what it meant to be a 16th century English queen. In the meantime, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and read more about the queens on our website. There you will also find a full transcript of this episode, plus the resources we used to prepare for this conversation. Long live the queens!